I'm really glad to be here with you all this evening. I am particularly excited to be helping Oksana launch her book, Still City, and to give everyone a kind of preview of this really wonderful, wonderful book and this great new voice in English language poetry. Um, I first met Oksana a few years ago now when I was editing Modern Poetry and Translation. Oksana is not just a poet, she's a translator as well from Ukrainian into English and English into Ukrainian. And she and her partner, Max Rosachinsky, published a wonderful anthology called Words for War. That anthology was published a few years ago in the wake of the invasion of Donbass. And it includes, I think, about 100 poems by various Ukrainian poets reflecting on their war experiences. And of course, when the full-scale invasion of Ukraine began in 2022, it was kind of indispensable. It was there already translated. It was already a kind of recording of all these voices and this whole generation of contemporary Ukrainian poets reflecting on war. Oksana has also translated a number of collections. She's translated Mariana Kianovska and Lyuba Yakimchuk, amongst others, to really very well-known and acclaimed writers. And she has really consistently practiced translation and poetry side by side. However, she is now launching her debut collection as an English language poet. And I should say that Oksana has already published two collections of poetry in Ukrainian. So she's that incredibly rare thing, a poet who writes in two languages, poetry in two languages. I'm slightly in awe of this because I often think of poetry as being a sort of barometer of the soul and of the language, and to think that someone could achieve that kind of fineness of thought and expression, and also that extremely complex understanding of cultural heritage in two languages is really amazing. But then I think actually I have to say I do think Oksana is amazing, and I'm sort of delighted because I feel like we're at the start of a very big journey, and all of you who are here with us tonight will remember this night as Oksana goes on to become a huge star. So it's with great excitement. I'll hand over to Oksana. As Jasmine says, please put your questions in the Q&A box. Please continue to say hello to us so we know where you're all coming, listening in from. And after Oksana's reading, we'll have a little conversation and ask some questions, and hopefully you can all be part of that. So Oksana, I'll pass over to you.
Thank you so much, Sasha, for this introduction, and thank you everybody for joining us here today. It's such a delight to hear from people I know, friends from all over the world who are logging in and coming to, I have this urge to wave to everybody as they leave a comment, and I see another friend popping up in the chat room. So please, please stay, and I'm so delighted to be working with this amazing press that I've admired for years. And today I will be reading some poems for about 15-20 minutes. And then, as Jasmine said, we'll have a discussion. So please think of questions to ask or just comments to make. I really appreciate the engagement. So I started working on the collection in 2021 when we first moved to Ukraine after the pandemic, and we made a life there. Our child was going to school, and at the same time there was this news of the potential invasion. And a lot of the poems in the first part of the collection reflect that experience of awaiting something that is uncertain, that's probably not going to happen. At least I definitely thought that it was so unlikely that it's more like a depiction of a fantasy scenario that would never possibly take place. And as the war progressed, I guess the poems changed as well. So I'm going to give you a full range from poems from the beginning of the collection, as well as some poems from the end of the collection and some from the middle. So this is one of the first poems I wrote, and it's called Intimate Relationship. I bought a hat of fox mink fur to wear in the war. In my hat, I sit in my cellar, waiting. The enemy's late. I read his messages on my phone, popping open jars of strawberry jam lining the cellar walls. Like a lover, my enemy sends me flowers, emojis, words of condolence, supplications, doctored screenshots, explicit photos. Several circles. What I see is an eye, while you're seeing a female breast, purple nipple on top like a cherry. Stubbornly phenomenal circles join, overlap, sending each mind on its own lonely journey. So Kandinsky and Claire sat in each other's lap for a little while, in a house they shared in Dessau. As outside the frame, yet another shape shed its flesh, exposing the blackened spine of a rising, inverted star. Here, beloved, taste my eyeball, rinsed in a special cocktail only I can craft in my mortal body. Cherry Orchard. A poet on the other side of the war writes, brothers and sisters fly up into immortality. Was it years or days ago that we read our poems in an underground gallery, surrounded by feminist art to an audience of teenagers? Drunk on wine by the fountain in City Square, we laughed so hard that a window opened, and a woman in a nightgown shook both her fists at us. Time to go, poetesses, you said, and we shared a kiss that could land us in prison in Mordovia. Now we each have a cellar in which to hide from bombs and aerial strikes. I wonder what supplies you stocked up on. Are they the same as mine? On your Facebook profile, a slogan, Motherland is everything, everything else is nothing. I scroll through your timeline, popping open the jar of jam I'd be saving for a rainy day. A gift from my hometown, no longer a place, but a name on a map, a ridge of rubble. Still life of a person with a pug. She was walking her pug down the street in a town where she spent her childhood and teenage years, still in her winter coat, even though it was getting warmer and the buds on the poplars grew engorged. Something bit her in the back, and she fell and lay there on the sidewalk. The next day, a neighbor brought out a sheet with tiny roses for that which was once her body, a matching pillowcase for the pugs. A passerby took a photograph and posted it on Telegram, causing an avalanche of angry emojis. Water under the bridge. No more bridge now, but the river flows as it did before, like a single tear rolls down the face of the landscape, tears through the terrain laid out for it by another tear and another before it. Doesn't grieve when the towns clustered along its banks lie in ruins. Doesn't weep, cradling the corpses, toying with the remains. Indiscriminate, like a poem's flow, reflecting everything, changing nothing. Drone footage. When a shell strikes a person, there is a scattering, resembling a flock of birds taking off, hands flying in the air, signaling, feet levitating in mid-kick. There are avian shapes casting shadows, lithe and carefree, from on high. Rocket in the room. What the rocket has in common with a room full of children is its current location. Somebody thought the rocket belonged in the room with children. And now it's here. In time, someone else will come and collect the pieces of the rocket and of the children, weeping and shouting insults at the sky. But for now, this rocket and these children are an unsorted matter, a puzzle, awaiting a solution. A lullaby with no theodicy. You're beautiful as a hand that waves hello in a window crisscrossed with tape still intact from a blast wave, as a whiff of perfume in the belly of the metro where sleepy civilians shelter in place during the rocket strikes, as a loaf of bread, solid and firm, handed by a masked person in a uniform without insignia out of an armored vehicle, as a charged phone that still has reception, inside it a loved one's voice echoing in a distant refuge, as an hour of electricity and running water in a city littered with dusty backpacks and tents of a clamoring foreign army. Tempo. What I didn't suspect about war is that there'd be music, not the kind that compels you to move in harmonious discord with the others, nor the kind that creates a burning in the loins to mix breath with breath, but the kind that irradiates every surviving nucleus, rendering you a creature absolutely new, facing the passage of time, naked and unashamed. In the intervals between war and wars, we discern the score, ready to war with planets and stars that coil around our fragile core, orderly and composed, like a tragic chorus. Mirroring. Blasts from afar reach in waves of liquefied light, and the muses are sirens. We've been shaken before, and now, practiced in bowing down, we puff our cheeks and blow. From a distance so great, terror is a flame over a thin church candle. It goes out like a passing thought. Don't pour wax in your ear, stranger. It'll seal your soul. Children outside play war. War plays along with the children, tossing them like fruit, forcing rot into a pip-lined core. Advice to a young poem. Stay little, poem, fine and sharp like a charm, mysterious, a maker of no sense. Fewer things can go wrong with fewer lines. Fewer promises break in fewer words. Little ones trickle out of the cage through bars one can barely see, seep through the capillaries in a windowless and evasive mind that's devised ways to protect itself against spells and magic. Helpless yet busily resilient, they form like clouds, woven of gauze and mucus, dealing in recovery of broken hope, delivery of the forgotten, inessential yet dear. Little ones of no weight are enough to transform as one peers into the sky, to the sound of an air raid siren, falls asleep in a bathtub, dances inside a cellar. Blank pages. And the epigraph. History is not the soil in which happiness grows. The periods of happiness in it are the blank pages of history. By Hegel. In a story of a life, too, happiness is a kind of silence, a lacuna of meaning, a sweet ellipsis. No disruptions, dangerous forks in the road, hard rocks to hurl, thrills that shake to the core. In the blessed lull of unearned, free-falling calm, there are stories to tell, words to form. Weaving verses out of faint gusts of wind, susurrating branches, filling the pages with clouds and trees, songbirds calling out of the thicket, shadows settled on a beloved face. Things so delicate and so thin, they barely appear on the clear film of a life well lived. Each day a rhyme for the previous day, synchronized and ordered. Kingdom of Ants. In the brief intermission between world wars, we somehow managed to weave a language out of the things we felt mattered for our future as an impermanent species. Barely even words, but collections of signals from distant planes of existence, patterns expressive of a communion between roots and surfaces, sprawling networks of fungi, projectiles of spores, shooting out like smart, self-navigating missiles, propagating a form of rebirth that would touch us all, impartially, indiscriminately. Approximations. Waking up in a borrowed room, in a body borrowed for a time, in a time borrowed and hardly used. I remember how light my head becomes when the boys overtaking us in the alley tickle me with guns, running them down my spine, then my hip, how I levitate, the force of a scream suppressed, lifting me up and up. And the way it gets dark when strange men pound on my door at night, shouting, "Open up or we'll break it in." Right before the war, I'd wake up in bed, dreaming of another bed, body in it exposed bone by bone, like a radiograph through a brilliance, an explosion tearing at the membranes that ensconce the sleeper. Close, yet not an exact match, like a rhyme in a poem you compose post-haste, lines blurred by terror. Ambush. In the hollow of a street we pause, like travelers entering a deserted city. Nobody here, but in windows, shadows, an occasional ghostly face, after images of a life there once was. Famished pigeons surround us, a wall of wings, closing in on two featherless bipeds bearing gifts. Seeds, the brittle bread we grew in an untidy kitchen. Rubble takes off from the sidewalk, scraps of tarp billow jubilantly. Forming a chorus, we dance, crumbs flying up like confetti. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Oksana. I'm just looking at the chat box, which is growing and growing. And I think that everyone found the reading as moving and as sort of devastating as I did. And I'm so grateful to you for sharing those poems and, allowing yourself to speak them to us. They seem, incredibly important. And I was really, because I read the manuscript a little while ago, as you know, and I haven't ever heard you read them before. So it's a really moving thing. Someone said in the chat that it was intimate but defiant, and I think that really sums it up. It was a beautiful reading. Um, and I also thought that it reminded me, at least, of the power of lyric to convey the most terrible things, because it's very easy to be to become cynical and worn by the news and the telegram channels that I listen to or I read every day. I don't feel as moved by them now as I did at the beginning of the war. And yet, when I heard you speaking your poems, I remembered how devastated I was, and I am again. So there's something about the lyric that continues to convey how awful and how almost inexpressible, what a paradox that it expresses the inexpressible grief of war and continues to do that. In the foreword to your collection, I wrote that the poems reminded me a little bit of Anna Sue's poems about the siege of Warsaw, also about of the poems of the young Keith Douglas about war, in the way that they juxtapose the completely ordinary and the utterly horrific. And again, I think that's something that lyric can do in good hands, in gifted hands, better than any other medium. And I felt like you kind of said that so eloquently this evening. I'm so grateful to you. Um, I think there are some poems, and I just wanted to encourage the audience to put your questions in the Q&A, your comments in the Q&A, so I can ask Oksana. But I did want to start with something that we talked about in an interview that we did together, which is about writing in two languages and how you switched between languages, what writing in English gave you, and a sort of extension to that, because I thought perhaps you might like to talk at a little bit of length about this. You translated a lot of work about war, poems by Ukrainian poets about war, which you then rendered in English. And I wondered how that shaped the English of your own poems about war. So take from that what you want to discuss and tell people about.
Thank you, Sasha, and thank you so much for the wonderful framing and the foreword. I really recommend that everybody reads the foreword on its own merits as an essay about the language of war and what poetry can accomplish. Doesn't mean that mine actually accomplishes it, but I think of my poems as one of the many voices that contribute to this experience and to the understanding of the experience, I guess, the transmission or conveying of what is going on. And I think maybe there are different kinds of poems, of course, but I think what happens after many years of being exposed to really dramatic content is that you become numb to it. And we especially become numb to the images of war, I think, to the graphic depictions of destruction, mangled up bodies, buildings that have collapsed. But I think maybe one of the things that the poems can do is they can bypass the numbness that we have cultivated by overexposure to too many images of violence, that the image is worth 1,000 words, I guess, is an English saying, but that also means that it's going to be so impactful that it's going to desensitize you to further, I think, depictions of the same kind of phenomenon or even thinking through it. So I think it's one thing to have a reaction to a war experience, and it's another thing to try to fill out the contours of how do we make sense of this? Like, what meaning does it have? How do we speak about it even? And I guess a lot of the poems in my collection raise this question about how to speak about this, and is poetry actually the right medium for doing it? perhaps it's the one we have, and perhaps it has advantages over the others, but still, as the other media, it's inadequate. And so a single poet's voice, I think, is also inadequate. That's why I think the anthology was such a great project, because it put together a chorus of voices that were quite different in their tonality, and also people whose experiences were very different. So some were much more absorbed in the context than others. My perspective on war is more distant, and I more mediated, I guess, by the news reports and social media posts. And I have spent I envisioned what it would be like to be under invasion and occupation, but in fact, my city was not occupied. Uh, my relatives have undergone occupation, but my own experiences then are extremely secondhand. And in an anthology, I guess you can actually have voices that come from people with different levels of familiarity with the phenomena that we are trying to kind of write around, because I think writing into them is often not the best way to think through them. Um, and I think writing in English gives me this advantage of I think, like, if I were to read any one of these poems, for example, in Ukrainian, I probably would be all like, I would melt into a stream of tears. But I think in another language, it gives me a more removed perspective. So I can actually maybe engage more of my cognitive faculties rather than just react emotionally to um, some of these vignettes and some of these scenarios that the poems are about.
We spoke a little bit in the interview about, actually, let me just say, the interview that we did is in PN Review. It's issue 272, and I understand from Michael Schmidt that the interview there's a paywall on it, but the paywall will be removed for the next day or so. So everyone who's here this evening can read the interview, which is a really extensive piece of writing by Oksana about her
Sure.
poetry, but also her background, and it is incredibly fascinating. And there's a selection of poems as well in that issue. And one of the things we talked about that fascinates me as a translator is the way that lyric operates very differently in Ukrainian and English. And Oksana, you're a practitioner of both. So your early collections were in Ukrainian, your later one was in English. And you talked a little bit about how English freed you up or gave you maybe a slightly different poetic personality. And I find that very intriguing and interesting, and wondered if you'd talk a little bit more about it.
Um, yeah, so one of the interesting things in my Ukrainian language poetry is that for a long time I couldn't even make a decision about whether to use feminine endings for the verbs I was using in the past tense, because I think at least the tradition that I respond to and that I engage with is has a tendency to really anonymize the speaker of the poem. So you're not supposed to be. I think that that's changed, and it's telling that I think the war actually justified and triggered a lot of these changes, because people started going back to their family histories and also trying to position the self as a witness, which I think imbued the self with various features that the actual poets also maybe could be said to share. But I think the tradition that I was responding to was a very philosophical, um, neutral. It was sort of trying, I think, to elevate or to create this high style of Ukrainian poetry where anyone could have written it with a specific set of talents. And it was so abstract and so universal that you couldn't actually discern the signature of an individual in it, because a signature of individual would be a mark of a flaw, like it would be a failure of some sort. So it's really like this Hegelian movement of elevating the work above any particulars and trying to create something like a formula that will speak to the universal human experience. And yes, switching to English opened me to a range of other types of writing that were maybe much more concerned with where the voice is coming from and how is my particular situation in the world, how my form of embodiment, for example, is shaping how I'm allowed or how I allow myself to speak and what the topics of this speech are. For example, in Ukraine, so many families shared this experience of the famine that I think nobody is really like writing about the famine or hasn't. Maybe in the past 10 years, people are beginning to review it because they view it as continuous with the neighboring states' policies towards Ukraine. So they're trying to make sense of the current moment in terms of this longer history. But to write about something like the famine would be like bad taste, because who are you telling this to, right? Your crowd or your readers have the same stories and they're just as equipped to speak about these experiences. So I think in some ways it's also trying to understand how your experience or your family's experience is really not normal and deserves this being voiced. It's not the standard, it's not okay. And there has to be somebody who makes sense of it, because in fact, it doesn't make sense the way that it has been transmitted to you.
Mhm. That's really, really fascinating. So, sort of a counterpoint from this a very formal, kind of classical, elevated tone in Ukrainian to a much way to a poetics that centers you much more um, in the work and gives you much more kind of agency. But still, there is something about your poetry that brings the two, I find, together somewhat, because I don't see. Yeah, there's something about the lyric, the use of lyric, the incredibly the composure, the absolute command of the language, and yes, flawed but not flawed, a bit like one of those Japanese vessels that is mended with gold, perhaps, or something like that.
Yeah, and I think it is about agency and about this ability to transcend, right? So you may think that an agent is who they are in the world, but you may also think that it's somebody who has overcome their limitations in order to reach some degree of freedom from these things that determine us, like specific language or gender or age or the moment in history in which we live. So I think a lot of poetry that I like has this motion to transcending the current and the present, but I think you also can allow yourself to speak about particular things at the same time.
I wanted to say that if you go into the chat box, the interview that I mentioned is now freely available, and there's a link to the interview. And you may want to copy that link before the end of the webinar, because I'm not sure if it doesn't disappear at that point, but maybe it will be sent round. Hopefully it will be, so you can read the interview. And also in the chat is the name of the anthology, Words for War, which is Academic Studies Press, and it's edited by Oksana and Max Rosachinsky. And it's quite easy to find. It has a wonderful website with lots of examples of poems on it as well. Before
And
I,
the whole anthology is open access.
ah,
Um, so everything is online and it's very easy to check out.
brilliant. I have a few questions, so I will ask a few of them. I'm just, so there is, uh, Michael, I'll come on to your question in a minute. There's a very technical question here from Timothy Sergey who says, I noticed the complete avoidance of periods, as if all the thoughts expressed here are expressed in passing, decidedly indeterminate and unconcluded. Can you say more about Hegel in particular? Was it Hegel who also characterized history itself as a slaughter bench? Of course, like others, I'm interested in English poetic influences. Could you have been thinking of Oscar Wilde's Harlot House with its dust whirling with the dust? And so that's I think that's not one question. I think you got a few for the price of one there.
Yeah, I feel like I'm so old at this point. I'm of an advanced age, so I've absorbed so much that I'm not completely aware where things are necessarily coming from. But with the punctuation, I have been actually quite influenced by the poets I've been translating. So Mariana Kianovska and Luba Yakimchuk both have this complex relationship with punctuation. And when I first started working with their poems, with Luba, I think it was about 10 years ago. And I said, in order to place them in journals in the US, we have to introduce punctuation. And she was like, okay, but I'd rather not. And here is why. And um, I think her idea is that everything that you do on the page, the way you organize the line breaks and the stanza breaks, is sufficient for guiding the reader and giving them a sense of pause. And so you don't necessarily have to litter the text with a lot of other signs that would be maybe compromising its appearance, its clean beauty. It's like you don't want to leave more tracks than is necessary for the reader to find where you are. And I think for me, it was maybe not so much a philosophical decision as also an aesthetic one. Having periods in particular, somehow, yeah, I think it changes the tone of things. Without the periods, you really have a sense of also continuity of the whole work as maybe one single expression, which is gives different iterations in different poems or acquired different iterations, but it's actually like a single diary with entries or a single poem with made of these fragments that are written at different moments in time. But there is never like a stop between them that would warrant a very clear separation of one poem from the next. So I suppose it's a question just of notation and of compositional unity that maybe I wanted to convey by avoiding the periods, but also the cleanliness of the page on which just a couple of things appear and they're there kind of shimmering without being contained on the page. Like there is a sense that things can spill out because I think the periods often function as like a container in a way. And of course, a page is also a visual container. So it's a little complicated.
Of course it is. I was going to ask, actually, it leads me into what I really wanted to talk to you about, which is I didn't mention this, but your day job is you're a philosopher. You teach philosophy, you write on philosophy, and there's a distinct sense, for me at least, in Still City, that you are concerned with the way that people think, kind of in extremis, when the conditions for their existence change. And I wondered if that was something that you could perhaps talk a little bit about.
Well, so I tend to work on ancient Greek philosophy and specifically on Plato and Aristotle. And for me, one of the interesting things about this period is just how extreme the conditions of Plato's life were, in the background of which it's all usually left in the background if you study philosophy, away from the actual conditions, the material conditions that produced it. But I think looking at the material conditions is very telling because there was the plague, there was the war, and I think a lot of this aspiration, the idealization of what could be, has to do with the specifics of the situation. So um, for me, Pete has asked about Hegel, and it's similar for Hegel too. It's the philosopher that has dealt with huge upheavals in history and Napoleonic Wars, and was also trying to make sense of these critical moments when things break apart and you cannot actually make a prediction about the future. What you have learned in the past is the past, and trying to figure out what will happen in the future on its basis is kind of trapping us in this deterministic way of thinking. So I think in many ways I was trying to resist this tendency to make predictions and to make judgments about how the situation might unfold or how it's unfolding, and to just register these spaces where um, things are in this moment of indeterminacy. We don't yet know the outcome, and we also don't know what we are doing, frankly, in the situation. There is no certainty that you're ever doing the right thing, that you're not involved, that you're not implicated, that you're not one of the guilty parties, that you're not complacent. And of course, in any given moment, you're also all of these things as well. So yeah, I think it's in the poetry, you can resist the kind of certainty that philosophy attempts to give you by enveloping these strange and weird phenomena in the theory that has predictive power, but in and diagnostic power. And I think it's really trying to step back and not impose um, that that gives poetry its particular edge.
Mm. I'll just go back to Michael's question. And Michael writes, he wondered how you would be able to read these poems, and it's difficult. Each time it will be hard and painful wherever you read, the children especially. And how do you protect yourself from such immediacy?
I have a selection of poems that I've read a number of times, so it's really habituating yourself, right? Like there is no way around it. At some point, you just have to um, get accustomed to actually reading these works. But there are a lot of poems that I cannot read, including the poems that I have translated by other poets that are so intimate for me and so um, overwhelming that I cannot actually read them. So they don't even have to be mine. It just, the
Mm.
work itself is very affecting.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I understand that. And you'll be glad to know that Words from War and poems from that have been read all over the place over the last couple of years by poets who have wanted to begin their own readings with a poem by a Ukrainian poet. So they have been read quite widely. I've heard them being spoken. So people are doing it for you, which is I thought, and do continue to add questions, but I just wanted to ask a little bit about some of the ground we cover in the interview, because it is really, really fascinating. And it's your background and childhood in Lviv in the west of Ukraine, which at the time when you were growing up was kind of a hotbed of Ukrainian culture and renaissance of Ukrainian culture, and your family was quite involved in that. And I thought perhaps it would be interesting to hear a little bit about that.
Right. So my dad is an actor, and his specialty is poetry. So I've grown up hearing poetry recited in various settings at home, on the stage. I've seen huge audiences enchanted by a poem, and I think what a lot of Americans are surprised by is that you can take something like poetry seriously. For me, this was never a question. I knew that this is like serious work because I've seen it hold the attention of hundreds of people. So I think poetry maybe has a status of maybe what like pop music has in the United States. You can actually count on people to really seek out this experience, which I think is cathartic for many. And in many ways, maybe music doesn't give you quite the depth because it relies on other modes of expression that could be quite distracting from the lyric. And I guess one of the things I learned also very early on is that it affects the body. It's not just cognitively effective. And I had a bird, a parrot, that whenever my father practiced, he would join him in the practice and would sing along and would also move his body in these very interesting ways. And to me, it really emphasized that it's not just about the content, it's also the sound and the melody and the rhythm. And this is something that the poet should seek to take advantage of, these mechanisms of, I think, getting the message across. So, yeah, it was also feeling like we're the resistance and in some ways that there is this adventurousness and risk of being part of the community we were a part of, that you could get arrested for very simple things like reciting a poem that maybe seemed a little bit too defiant to the Soviet authorities, or that you could get canceled, or your career would never take off because once you made like a bad joke in front of three people and it was recorded and went to the wrong authorities. So it was the sense of being under surveillance always, but also of doing something adventurous and risky in preserving this Ukrainian tradition of poetry and underground poetry.
And I have got a couple more questions here, actually. And forgive me, Sibylla and Jamie, I didn't scroll down on the question and answer thing, and I've only just seen your questions. But Sibylla asks, could you say a bit about which poets, Anglophone and Ukrainophone, are the most important and influential for your own writing?
Well, yeah, as I was saying about the influences, I tend to read a lot, and every I have like my little circle of interlocutors, and it used to be that I would be really think that I'm speaking to the dead, that they are like my people, only the ones who have died, and some of them have been dead for a really long time, like the ancient Greek poets that I love and read. But I think in the past few years, and maybe also with doing the anthology, I have also realized that you have to speak to your contemporaries and you have to be in conversation with people working today. And that much of the work that we do now is not going to be immortal, but that's not a problem. It used to be that I thought that there is no point in composing something if it's not going to last. Now, again, I think there is a lot of value of making sense of the current moment for the current moment. And again, that could be transcended in a couple of years, in 10 years, after your lifetime. That's not what matters. A lot of us contribute to this work that is not going to lead to individual survival, but I think it's a contribution to the practice, the craft that we find valuable, and keeping that alive through generations. So I've started thinking of it more as a transmission and as a collaborative effort rather than an individual triumph. overcoming, I don't know, anonymity or what else threatens a younger, anxious poet who are trying to make a name for themselves. Because in the end, I think very little that is happening is unique. A lot of the things that we as poets do have been done um, in 4th century BCE in all of these different ancient Greek contexts. And just, it was like just a sliver of what was actually going on. So just like responding to even the sliver and appreciating how much diversity and variety there was in that segment and people of different races and genders speaking to each other. I think if we can maintain that, we'll be in a really good place.
We have to keep the parrot dancing as well.
Yes, the bird dancing and the swan singing.
And there's a last question from Jamie O'Halloran, who asks if you're going to translate your poems into Ukrainian.
Hmm. I've been thinking whether it would make sense to translate my Ukrainian poems into English. I think these poems are just too close for me right now to even consider translating them. While I think the Ukrainian language poems, I've written them a while ago, so they seem like works by a different person. And I have more distance to enable me to do that. And I wonder what the purpose would be, in part because they're so anonymous. It's like they would maybe I mean, I could do creative retranslations where there are basically new poems that are somehow inspired or speaking to this earlier work. Um, and I think that could be acceptable. But in many ways, the traditions that I engage with are so different. And I think in yeah, to some extent, also, I couldn't really do in English what is interesting about my work in Ukrainian, which is these exquisite rhymes that, that would be often the goal of the poet to come up with new rhymes, which is not something that an English language poet is necessarily going to worry about and lose sleep over.
I don't know. Thank you so much. And I think we've answered all the questions. There was a question from Robin Early, but I think you did answer it as you were speaking. So I won't put that one to you. So I think, oh, I'm sorry, there is one here. And we'll perhaps end on this question by Daniel. And he asks, can you please share if there are any particular topics you're working with now that create this feeling like you first need to give yourself permission to speak about them, as you said earlier, to allow yourself before you can actually start writing about them? How do you overcome this tension, or how do you coexist with it?
Mm, I think often actually it's dialogical for me, which I think that's what the advantage that being a translator gives you, that you see other people speak about certain things and you want to enter that conversation. So lots of people are writing about war. Um, I think the writing is really good and compelling, and I also have things to say, so I will contribute to the conversation. Um, I think right now I have this collection that is taking shape about um, various family stories, like a collection of family stories. And again, it's so private and so intimate, and it's like a sort of biography or a memoir. And maybe I wouldn't even necessarily feel compelled to write it, except I've seen other people also do this in very interesting and compelling ways, and I've seen that it should be done. So yeah, I think the permission is often, at least at this point, granted by entering conversations.
Mm. Yeah.
But But I think that's the general problem of the poet. I think often when you begin writing, and this is what Leonard Cohen said, the advantage of a very young poet is that they don't think they need like any kind of license yet. They are just going to write their work and think it's really worthwhile and the best, maybe, and everybody should hear it and it deserves to be heard. And I think as an older poet, you realize how much good work there is and that your work is as deserving as anyone else's. And so it's more about maybe also illuminating the work of other people because you engage with it. So it's casting light on what else is going on, and forming these communities where you can mutually inspire each other.
That's a profound and quite idealistic way to think, particularly in the face of something that's going on that threatens to disrupt and destroy all those fine networks of human contact. So I'm sort of glad that we're ending on a note of positivity. And I just wanted to say before we end the event that I was really glad to hear you read. It was a spellbinding reading. But Oksana is going to be in the UK in the autumn. And if you follow Carcanet newsletter or on Twitter or social media, you'll be able to catch up and find out about the dates and places that she's reading, where she's going to be reading her work. And also PN Review, don't forget to take the link to the interview with Oksana, which you can read, and subscribe to PN Review for more of Oksana's work, I have no doubt. And also try and get hold of a copy of Still City. It's actually quite a large collection. What you heard there was a very small selection from the work, and it is remarkable for being entirely at that level. Really great poems. It's a sort of extraordinary debut. Well, it isn't really a debut, but it's one of the most extraordinary books about war I've had the privilege to read. And I want to recommend it to everyone. Thank you so much, Oksana, for such a brilliant evening. And I'll hand back to Jazz now to finish up.
Thank you so much, Sasha, and thank you so much to the amazing audience. The questions were wonderful, and it was so good to be with everybody.